Vladimir Lenin. During World War I, the February Revolution of 1917 brought about the collapse of the Russian Empire. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power through the October Revolution. Their rise to power, however, alarmed the Allied powers, who feared the rapid spread of socialism and were concerned by the Bolsheviks' promise to withdraw from the war through the Treaty of Brest-Litowsk. Even within the Bolshevik Party, many opposed the treaty for its harsh conditions, but Lenin proceeded with it, believing peace was necessary. In response, the Allied powers began supporting the remaining monarchist and Republican forces, collectively known as the White Army, which triggered the Russian Civil War. Internally, the situation within Soviet-controlled areas was dire. Major cities were suffering from severe food shortages that had worsened since World War I. Despite surveillance and crackdowns by the Cheka and the Red Army, strikes and protests continued. To address the crisis, the Soviet government launched a campaign of forced grain requisitioning, particularly in regions along the Volga River. This policy led to a devastating famine. Even the Soviet government acknowledged 5 million deaths, while some historians estimate that over 10 million may have perished. In the early stages of the Civil War, the Soviet regime lost control of much of its territory, holding on only to a few central cities. However, the Bolsheviks eventually secured victory. On December 30, 1922, at the First All-Union Congress of Soviets, 4 republics, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation came together to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At the time of the Russian Revolution, socialism had only existed as an ideology, never as a functioning system of government. Capitalism, by contrast, was a developed social system. The creation of the Soviet Union as the world's first socialist state sparked widespread debate. German Marxist theorist Karl Kautsky criticized the new regime, calling it a Balkan-style dictatorship and arguing that a revolution carried out without democratic procedures would inevitably lead to totalitarianism. In response, Lenin and his close ally and theorist Leon Trotsky dismissed Kautsky's criticism, insisting that theory must adapt to reality. According to Marx's historical materialism, the transition from socialism to communism was meant to occur gradually and through democratic means. However, Lenin and Trotsky believed that the imperialist stage of capitalism had made this path impossible. They argued that an armed proletariat should transform imperialist wars into civil wars and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat through violent revolution. But the newly established Soviet state faced serious challenges. Low productivity and widespread poverty posed immediate threats to its survival. The Soviet Union was far from an industrial powerhouse. As late as 1928, its industrial output was only 1/8 that of the United States. The Russian Empire had been slow to industrialize, only beginning to do so in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the new Soviet state was still seen as a poor, agrarian society by Western standards. To rebuild the war-ravaged economy, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, which allowed limited private enterprise and small-scale capitalism in an effort to restore economic stability. During Lenin's rule, former elites such as merchants, landowners, wealthy farmers, military officers, nobles, and clergy were subjected to political repression. They were stripped of voting rights and barred from serving in the Red Army. Their children were also banned from enrolling in the Soviet military and military academies. These restrictions were not lifted until 1935 when the Red Army underwent major reforms. Joseph Stalin. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle erupted within the Communist Party. Joseph Stalin, advocating for socialism in one country, eventually outmaneuvered his rivals, including Trotsky, who had championed global revolution, and by 1928, he emerged as the supreme leader. Stalin sought to transform the Soviet Union, still a largely agrarian society, into an industrial powerhouse by setting ambitious industrial production targets. In 1931, he declared, "We are 50 years behind the West. We must make up this gap in 10 years and place the entire economy under centralized state control." As a result, the Soviet Union experienced rapid industrial growth that soon began to rival the West. While the Great Depression crippled Western economies, the Soviet Union, operating within a closed economic system, was relatively insulated from its effects. This allowed the USSR to sustain growth and, during the 1930s, achieve unprecedented economic expansion, becoming the leading industrial power in Europe by 1938. However, this success came at a tremendous human cost. While the state became stronger, the quality of life for the Soviet people under Stalin did not improve. In pursuit of rapid industrialization, Stalin collectivized agriculture and squeezed both farmers and member republics for resources. This policy led to catastrophic famines, including the Holodomor. Unlike heavy industry, light industry remained underdeveloped, resulting in chronic shortages of basic goods. Alongside economic transformation, Stalin launched a brutal political campaign known as the Great Purge. He targeted perceived enemies and countless innocent citizens, sending them to gulags in Siberia and Western Russia. His grip on power was absolute. Stalin's most formidable rival, Leon Trotsky, fled to Mexico but was assassinated in 1940 by Ramon Mercader, an agent sent by Stalin. Stalin denied involvement, but his successor Khrushchev later awarded Mercader the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. During the same period, as Western powers faltered under the weight of the Great Depression, both Stalin's Soviet Union and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany surged forward. Initially, Stalin sought a security alliance with Western European nations to counter the anti-communist stance of Germany, but when negotiations failed, he shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler. In the early stages of World War II, the USSR joined Germany in partitioning Poland and later invaded Finland, gaining territory in the process. However, this alliance was short-lived. In June 1941, Hitler launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army suffered massive losses in the early stages of the German-Soviet War due to a disorganized command structure, a long-standing issue that had persisted even before Stalin's purges and the overwhelming impact of the surprise attack. Despite this, the Soviets managed to defend key cities such as Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Stalingrad in the south. In 1943, the tide of war began to turn with the Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. From that point on, the Red Army launched a strong counteroffensive that eventually led to the capture of Berlin in May 1945. In August 1945, following the United States' atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and began a massive military campaign from Manchuria. Japan surrendered on August 15. Although the victory was significant, it came at an immense human cost. Nearly 30 million Soviet citizens died during the war. In Russia, this conflict is remembered as the Great Patriotic War. The devastation destroyed the foundations of Soviet agriculture and industry, and rebuilding demanded great sacrifices from the people. A severe famine in 1946 and 1947, caused in part by ongoing agricultural collectivization and wartime destruction, resulted in the deaths of an additional 900,000 people. Despite these hardships, the rewards of victory were substantial. The Soviet Union had previously lost large territories that once belonged to the Russian Empire. Before the end of World War, the only communist countries were the Soviet Union, the Mongolian People's Republic, and the Tuvan People's Republic, which was later incorporated into the USSR. After the war, the Soviet Union regained much of its lost land and extended its influence across all of Eastern Europe, including East Germany. In Asia, countries such as North Korea, China, and Vietnam adopted communism with Soviet support. Even in the Western Hemisphere, Fidel Castro's revolution transformed Cuba into a communist state just off the coast of the United States, creating a lasting source of tension. The Soviet Union also backed leftist movements and political groups across Latin America, spreading its ideology deep into a region long considered to be under American influence. With its vast industrial output and powerful military, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower equal to the United States. As the leading nation of the communist bloc, it entered into a prolonged global rivalry, with the West known as the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev. After the death of Joseph Stalin, Georgy Malenkov briefly became the leader of the Soviet Union. However, he quickly lost a power struggle and resigned after only 6 months. Nikita Khrushchev then took over as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Khrushchev strongly criticized Stalin, calling him a ruthless dictator. He led a campaign to dismantle Stalin's cult of personality, eased repression in society, and softened the brutal politics of Stalin's era, where losing a power struggle often meant execution. The number of political prisoners in the Gulag dropped from about 3 million under Stalin to around 1 million by 1956. This movement to denounce Stalin shocked not only the Soviet Union and the West, but also the broader communist world. In response, Mao Zedong of China accused Khrushchev of revisionism. This led to a sharp rift between the two countries, resulting in the Sino-Soviet split and even border clashes between the two powers. In Eastern Europe, the effects were also felt. Countries like Poland and Hungary saw anti-Soviet protests. The Soviet Union responded with force, violently crushing the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Although the Soviet Union had become a global superpower under Stalin, the Russian Civil War, the Great Purge, widespread famine, and the devastation of World War II left the standard of living for ordinary people extremely low. Under Khrushchev, the country began to recover, and the quality of life improved significantly. Living standards rose, and limited freedoms were introduced. Western magazines, certain films, books, music, and forms of art became accessible. The economy continued to grow, and some criticism of the party was tolerated. Cultural and diplomatic exchanges with the West increased as well. Still, the Cold War and the ideological rivalry with the United States continued. Khrushchev's era marked a high point in the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This was followed by sending a dog into space, and in 1961, the first human. In 1962, the Soviets sent the first woman into space. These milestones shocked the United States and gave the USSR a significant early lead in space exploration. However, Khrushchev faced serious failures in agricultural policy and angered the military by attempting to reduce conventional forces. As his political support weakened, he was eventually removed from power in 1964 by conservative elements within the Communist Party. Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev as General Secretary of the Communist Party. The period of Brezhnev's leadership is often referred to in the West as the era of stagnation. On the surface, Soviet society appeared stable, but beneath that stability was a growing economic lag behind the advanced capitalist nations. A rigid top-down bureaucratic system gradually eroded the social structure. Economic growth slowed, labor productivity declined, and reform attempts, when they existed at all, were mostly ineffective. Still, living standards under Brezhnev improved considerably, and overall, Soviet citizens enjoyed a more stable quality of life. Political purges, like those seen under Stalin, were largely absent. However, the intense arms race with the United States pushed defense spending to 12% of the Soviet GNP. By 1978, the Soviet Union even surpassed the US in the size of its nuclear arsenal. Despite the stagnation, the Soviet Union remained the dominant power in the communist bloc. After declaring the Brezhnev Doctrine, the USSR violently suppressed dissent in Eastern Europe, turning events like the Prague Spring and the Polish protests into bloody crackdowns. In 1979, the US launched a new containment policy against the Soviet Union. This came after the fall of Iran's Pahlavi dynasty during the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which threatened to undermine American influence in the Indian Ocean region. One of the first measures taken by the Carter administration was a grain embargo. Soviet agriculture had been severely damaged by Stalin's collectivization policies and never fully recovered, despite large-scale efforts by both Khrushchev and Brezhnev to reclaim and improve farmland. The USSR still could not produce enough food to meet its own needs, highlighting deep flaws in its agricultural and livestock systems. In stark contrast to the Russian Empire, which had once fed much of Central Europe, the Soviet Union had to import over 25 million tons of grain annually to the United States. Believing this supply could not be replaced, the Carter administration cut off grain exports to the USSR. However, when the embargo caused a flood of excess grain to hit the global market, prices collapsed. American farmers suffered heavy losses, while the Soviet Union managed to temporarily sidestep the crisis by purchasing grain from other countries at newly discounted prices. At the same time, the Carter administration began arming Afghan rebels with weapons, including Stinger surface-to-air missiles. These rebels, operating mostly in rural areas, encircled Soviet-held cities and military bases. The Soviet army was forced to rely heavily on air transport. As the Mujahideen's firepower increased with U.S. support, their guerrilla tactics became especially effective against Soviet helicopters. Unable to find a way out, the USSR poured enormous resources into the conflict without achieving meaningful results. While the overall economic embargo failed, it succeeded in creating massive financial strain on an already fragile Soviet economy that depended heavily on raw material exports. At the time, the USSR could still endure thanks to relatively high oil prices, but its underlying weaknesses became increasingly exposed. Brezhnev's long tenure also led to a significant problem of aging leadership. Many senior officials in the Communist Party aged alongside him, and after his death, the Soviet leadership faced a succession crisis. His immediate successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, both died in office from age-related illnesses. This created a prolonged power vacuum that further destabilized the system. Mikhail Gorbachev. It was in this turbulent context that a young Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. Beginning in 1985, he implemented perestroika and glasnost. However, in the latter half of that year, A price war between Saudi Arabia and the US-UK alliance caused global oil prices to collapse in 1986, drastically reducing Soviet revenues. That same year, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, the worst nuclear accident in human history, further strained the country's finances. On top of that, Glasnost exposed deep-rooted corruption and criminality within the Soviet system, damaging the legitimacy of both the Communist Party and the government itself. Once economic controls were loosened, inflation spiraled out of control, and the state had no effective way to contain it. Gorbachev also enacted sweeping military cuts. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet military had over 5 million troops, but that number dropped below 3 million during Gorbachev's era. Strategic assets, including intermediate-range missiles, were reduced to roughly 3/4 of their previous levels. Overall defense spending was slashed by more than 30%. As a result, Gorbachev's reform policies failed to achieve their intended goals and instead triggered the economic, political, and social collapse of the Soviet Union. Suppressed nationalist sentiments began to resurface. Eventually, regions like the Baltic states began calling for independence from the USSR, demanding national sovereignty and a return to a capitalist market economy. Gorbachev attempted to preserve the Union through a nationwide referendum, and among the 9 republics that participated, 77.8% supported maintaining the federation. However, in August of that same year, hardliners within the Communist Party who opposed Gorbachev's reform agenda launched a coup. Although the coup failed due to resistance led by Boris Yeltsin and the Russian people, it marked a turning point. Power effectively shifted from Gorbachev to the more radical reformer Yeltsin. Public sentiment in Ukraine, which had previously supported maintaining the Union, also changed, ultimately accelerating the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin became the first president of the newly formed Russian Federation. However, in his rush to transition to capitalism, he plunged the country into economic chaos. Realizing the political cost of his failures, Yeltsin chose to step down on December 31, 1999, handing over the presidency to his successor, Vladimir Putin, and retiring from politics.